In 1348, 1 in every 5 crimes recorded in English court rolls was murder. Not theft, not assault, murder. Think about that for a moment. In a country with no police force, no detective, no forensics, where the person accusing you of a crime might be your neighbor, your rival, or the man who wanted your land, nearly 1/5 of all criminal cases that made it to court involved someone's death. What happened to the man accused of that murder? He had no lawyer, he could not hire counsel or call witnesses on his own behalf. He stood before 12 men from his village, men who might have known him since childhood or known the victim or both. And those 12 men decided whether he lived or died. If they said guilty, there was only one outcome: a walk to the gallows that same week. But here is the fact that almost no one talks about. Most men accused of murder in medieval England were acquitted. Not because the system was fair, but because the system was designed with a hidden escape hatch that was only available to certain people. And for everyone else, the law was not justice, it was a weapon. But in 1348, something arrived in England that didn't just change who got punished, it changed what a crime even was. Courts fell empty. Judges fled their own benches. The men who wrote the laws watched their world dissolve in a matter of weeks. And when enough people had died, when half of England lay in the ground, the survivors did something extraordinary. They used the law not to protect the innocent, but to trap the living. Within 1 year of this moment, simply walking away from your village would become a crime. Within 3 years, asking for a fair wage would get you imprisoned. In the next 15 minutes, you are going to see exactly how justice worked in medieval England in the year the world cracked open. Real crimes, real punishments, real court records, and the precise moment in the summer of 1348, when a single ship docking at an English port made every law, every judge, and every punishment in the kingdom obsolete overnight. This is not a story about the past being brutal. This is a story about what people do to each other when they are terrified and who gets to call it justice. Before we get to the plague and the chaos it brought, you need to understand the world it destroyed. Because medieval justice was not simply random cruelty. It had a logic, a deeply specific, deeply unequal logic. And once you understand it, everything that follows will make a different kind of sense. England in 1348 had no professional police force. The system for detecting crime and bringing criminals to justice was crude. Community self-policing was the order of the day. If you witnessed a crime, you had one option. You raise the hue and cry. You shouted. And every person in your village was legally required to stop what they were doing and join the chase. If they didn't, the whole village could be fined. Every free male over the age of 12 was enrolled in a group of roughly 10 men called a tithing. They each took responsibility for the actions of the other members. If one of them broke the law, the other group members had to make him come to court or pay a fine themselves. When a serious case reached court, the defendant had no counsel. A jury of 12 men, men who might have known the defendant or the victim or both, decided whether he lived or died. If found guilty, a defendant typically faced capital punishment, a walk to the gallows. The law also contained a loophole so significant it functioned almost as a second legal system. If you were a clergyman or could prove minor holy orders, your case transferred to a church court, which could not impose the death penalty. The church's goal was not punishment, but the salvation of the soul. Since the only real test of clerical status was the ability to read a passage from the Psalms, literacy became a literal lifeline. The same act, committed by 2 men side by side, could result in one walking free and the other hanged. Class and education determined everything. Court records from the period 1300 to 1348 show that theft accounted for 73.5% of all offenses. Murder and manslaughter made up 18.2%. Receiving stolen goods added 6.2%. The remaining 2.1% covered arson, counterfeiting, rape, and treason. The overwhelming dominance of theft tells you something important. The main cause of crime was poverty, or medieval England was a place of chronic want. Most people were peasants, bound to the land, farming strips in common fields, surviving on bread, ale, and whatever vegetables they could grow. A bad harvest didn't mean belt tightening, it meant starvation. In that world, theft was not a moral failing, It was survival. You could expect to be hanged for theft if you stole something valuable enough. Property and land were the primary concerns of the ruling elite. Trespasses, poaching, and theft were therefore taken very seriously. The nearly 20% murder rate in court records can be compared with the 19th century, where it was around 2%, and today, where it is a tiny proportion. Historians attribute this partly to the fact that in the absence of medical care, wounds that would be survivable today became fatal. Men also carried blades routinely. Arguments escalated into stabbings with a speed that modern life rarely sees. Beyond the major crimes, there was a whole landscape of lesser offenses. Brewing ale without a license, trading on a Sunday. Women were brought before manor courts for persistent scolding. An iron frame called the scold's bridle, locked around the head and fitted with a metal spike to press the tongue flat. Children over 7 were tried and punished exactly the same as adults. The church courts handled a separate landscape: drunkenness, swearing, non-attendance at mass, practicing magic, defamation, adultery. These courts sat separately from the royal courts and imposed their own penalties, usually public penance or excommunication. Fines, pillorying, floggings, mutilation, and, in the most serious cases, hanging were used in preference to imprisonment. People were kept in jails to await trial, but long-term imprisonment was rarely used as a punishment. For serious offenses, the penalties escalated sharply. Mutilation was a standard intermediate punishment. A thief convicted for the first time might lose one ear. A repeat offender might lose the other. A man convicted of a serious property crime might have his hand cut off, not just as punishment, but as a permanent mark. In an era without photographs or fingerprints, the body itself became the criminal file. Your crimes were written on your flesh so that every stranger you met could read them. For the gravest offenses, death. Hanging was the standard execution method, and it was emphatically public. The scaffold stood in the center of town. People gathered. The condemned was sometimes carted through the streets beforehand. The purpose was not simply to kill one person. It was to make an impression on everyone watching. Fear was the primary instrument of deterrence in a world with no police force. Treason warranted something worse than hanging. Men convicted of treason were hanged, drawn, and quartered, a deliberately prolonged sequence that ended with the body cut into pieces and displayed across the country. Women convicted of treason were burned at the stake, the same sentence used for heresy. Burning carried theological weight. Fire was considered a purifying force. One woman is recorded to have spent almost a year in Guildford jail, charged with the theft of jewelry before coming to trial, only to be acquitted. Imprisonment itself was not a punishment, but a year in a medieval jail with inadequate food, no sanitation, and no medical care could easily kill you before your case was ever heard. And then, in the summer of 1348, everything stopped. It arrived on a ship. The Grey Friars Chronicle of King's Lynn records the moment. 2 ships came alongside at Melcombe in Dorset a little before midsummer. One of the sailors had brought with him from Gascony the seeds of a terrible pestilence, and through him the men of the town of Melcombe were the first in England to be infected. The disease moved like fire through dry grass. By November 1348, the plague had reached London, and up to 30,000 of the city's population of 70,000 inhabitants succumbed. The dying were described by a monk of Westminster. Ulcers broke out in the groin and armpit, which tortured the dying for 3 days. Untreated, bubonic plague kills 8 out of 10 it infects. There was no treatment. The mortality rate in 1348 to 9 is now widely accepted at around 50%. Some areas lost 2/3 of their people. The country that had entered 1348 with perhaps 6 million inhabitants emerged from the plague with 3 million or fewer. In 1348, the Commons complained to the king about lawlessness in the country and the failure of the justices to deal with it properly. That was before the plague hit. Afterward, it became almost impossible to hold court at all. As people began to die, society started to break down, and it became difficult to replace those responsible for law and order. There was looting from the dead and dying. Most of the increase in crime related to theft of foodstuffs. Some people were desperate enough to steal the clothes off the backs of corpses, even those who had died of plague. There is at least one recorded instance of a man breaking into a house to steal. When enough people had died, the survivors faced a world turned upside down, and the response of England's ruling class tells you everything about what the law had always really been for. Before the plague, land and food were scarce, while labor was abundant. After the plague, the situation was exactly reversed. Lots of land, far fewer mouths to feed, and a severe shortage of labor. This empowered both the unlanded laborer and the tenant, both of whom could now negotiate for better terms. And it threatened the incomes of the ruling class. Edward III's response was wide-ranging and ambitious national legislation. The Ordinance of Laborers was issued on the 18th of June, 1349, while the pandemic was still raging throughout most of eastern, Midland, and northern England. Crisis legislation drawn up hurriedly to address the immediate shortage of labor as the vital grain harvest loomed. Everyone under the age of 60, except traders and craftsmen, had to work for wages set at their pre-plague levels. It was made an offense for landless men to seek new masters or to be offered higher wages. The first official English vagrancy statute, the Statute of Laborers, was passed in 1349. It made it an offense to give alms to anyone able to work. The law was intended to force anyone who was able to work to do so. Walking away from your lord's land, which had been practically impossible before the plague, was now a prosecutable crime. One surviving court record from 1374 presents the case of Alice, wife of John Redhead, charged with abandoning her contracted service and working outside the town in order to get higher wages, to the harm of her lord and against the form of the ordinance. Alice was not a thief. Alice had not assaulted anyone. Alice had looked at what her labor was worth in the open market and tried to claim it. For that she was brought before the king's justices. The law that put her there had been created from scratch in direct response to the Black Death, written by the men who feared losing control of the people who had survived it. Let us be honest about what we have seen. Medieval justice was not simply barbaric chaos. It was a system, detailed, structured, and in some respects surprisingly thoughtful. Courts considered the mental state of the accused. Cases involving lunatics, the frenzied, and those acting under extreme duress were handled with legal nuance. The high acquittal rates are real. The system did not simply execute everyone it touched, but the system was fundamentally designed to protect the interests of those at the top of the feudal hierarchy. The public hangings, the mutilations, the brandings existed not primarily to punish the guilty, but to project power onto everyone watching. The majority of punishments were carried out in public. The goal was to punish offenders, keep order, and scare others from breaking the law. And then 1348 came and the mask slipped entirely. When the plague killed half the population and survivors tried to use their new leverage to demand better lives, the law did not protect them. The English government used the law as a means of controlling class structure, forming a cohesive government in order to hold the upper and lower orders to their respective obligations. New crimes were invented to describe behaviors that had never been crimes before. Asking for a fair wage, leaving your village, accepting a better offer. This is what 1348 teaches us, if we are willing to look at it clearly. Justice systems do not simply reflect the values of their time. They reflect the fears of the people with the power to right them. When those people felt secure, the law could afford nuance, even mercy. When they felt threatened, the law became something else entirely. The crimes of 1348 tell us about poverty, desperation, and the brutal logic of survival. The punishments tell us about fear, about a ruling class determined to make consequences visible enough to deter anyone from stepping out of line. And the laws written in the years immediately after tell us something that remains, if we are paying attention, recognizable today. The line between justice and cruelty is always thinner than we believe. and it is always drawn by whoever holds the power. This has been 1348, Crime and Harsh Punishments. Thank you for watching.